few years ago, we did a video titled, "What Gun Would Jesus Carry?" Strangely, we did that video primarily because we got asked that question a lot. Mostly out of sarcasm, but it's a reasonable question and we wanted to answer it. Now we're going to take a look at what gun would David carry? Well, in order to truly know what kind of gun a guy would carry, you really need to get to know that person. When it comes to the life of David, there's really several different stages in his life that I think he would have carried different guns. Let's start with David the shepherd boy. Well, David the shepherd boy was one who was a person who looked over the flock and he cared for the flock. And he would oftentimes go after animals and predators that were after the flock as well. So I believe David the shepherd boy would have carried a Henry 22 LR. If we take a look at 1 Samuel 17, starting in verse 22, what's taking place here is David the shepherd boy shows up where the front line of the Philistines are, and we see Goliath for the first time. So let's take a look at that. Picking up in 24. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king, will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption in Israel." Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So here we have this shepherd boy. Now, David was one who was a man after God's own heart. And that's important. We're going to come back to that a little later to talk about what other guns David would have carried. But here he comes up against a giant, Goliath, who was, for all intents and purposes, able to whoop anybody on that battlefield. Pick it up in 32. Then David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." So here we have David completely unafraid because he knows he is on the side of God. Let's continue on with 37. Moreover, David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So Saul clothed David with his armor. If this event took place today, what King Saul would have given David would have been his level 4 body armor and an IMI Goliath. Let's continue. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and as he clothed him with his coat of mail, and David fastened his sword to his armor, and he tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." So David took them off. So I believe then David, with just simply wearing shepherd's clothes and armed with a Henry lever action 22 LR, he would have taken 5 smooth, round-tipped, lead bullet 22 LRs and gone out and met Goliath. What Goliath would have been armed with was level 4 body armor and a 30-pound Barrett M107A1 semi-automatic 50 BMG. And we all know how that went down. If it happened today, he would have taken him out with one clean shot to the forehead with a Henry 22 LR. He would have walked up to Goliath, picked up his Barrett, shot him once in the neck with a 50 BMG to remove his head, and that would have been the end of the story. Now, David continues from that moment on for the rest of his life. He continued, but he continued as a warrior. So now we're going to take a look at what kind of gun would David carry as warrior David? Well, let's start. David was a man after God's own heart. And God loves a warrior. God himself is a warrior. Exodus 15:3 says God is a man of war. And here we go. David then fights for King Saul. Then he flees from Saul. And then he pursues war the whole time he's fleeing from Saul. And eventually he becomes king. Now David the warrior, I believe would have, because he's a warrior for the armies of Israel, he would have carried a Glock 17. That's the sidearm of the Israeli military, and I believe he would have carried an IWI Tavor in 5.56 by 45 millimeter NATO. You know, war never stopped for David all the way up until his death. There was always this state of war that he was in the middle of. But again, David was a man after God's own heart, and God is a warrior. You know, David was an awesome guy, but I believe young David the shepherd, a Henry Lever Action 22 LR. David the warrior, a Glock 17, and an IWI Tavor. So there you go. There's my 2 cents on what gun would David carry. I'm sure there's a lot of opinions out there, would be my guess. Put them in the comments below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. If you feel called to support our channel through Patreon, that link is also below. But the most important part of this channel is we take prayer requests. Never hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.